Would you pray with me? Father, as we consider your words to us in 1 Timothy 5, would you please enlighten our minds to understand your words through your Spirit? Would you please equip us for every good work? And we ask in the name of Jesus, amen. Let's go to the Word. Open your Bible to 1 Timothy 5. 1 Timothy 5. As I preach through 1 Timothy, the next passage I'm preaching on is 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16. So let's begin reading 1 Timothy 5 in verse 3. Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander, for some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. That was a lot. That's a long passage. What is the main idea of this passage? It was the very beginning. You can see it in verse 3. The main idea is the opening command: honor widows who are truly widows. So I'd like to preach to you on 1 Timothy 5, 3 to 16 on this subject: honor widows. So let's start briefly with 4 introductory questions. First, what was it like to be a widow in the world of the Old and New Testaments? So in the historical, cultural context of the Bible, it was typical for women to marry when they were young, really young by our standards today. And they were typically significantly younger than their husbands. So it's not surprising. It was more common for a husband to die before his wife died. That means that there were more widows than widowers. One ancient historian of the ancient world, the historian is not ancient, one historian of the ancient world estimates that about 40% of women between ages 40 and 50 were widows, and that these widows constituted about 30% of the women. And in that cultural context, sadly, it was financially crippling to be a widow. Second question, why did Paul write these instructions about widows? Well, the historical cultural context of the passage we just read seems to me to be that the church in Ephesus was spreading its financial resources too thinly. So it reminds me of a line of Bilbo Baggins in The Fellowship of the Ring when he says, I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread. That's what the church was doing with their financial resources. They were apparently supporting every single widow, young and old, ungodly and godly, widows connected to relatives and widows without any relatives. And Paul here in this passage is instructing the church how to be good stewards of their financial resources as they honor widows. You notice at the end of our passage, verse 16, the last sentence says, "Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows." So why did Paul write these instructions? The answer is the church was apparently supporting every widow, and they needed to handle their resources more responsibly. Question 3, what does God think of widows? Well, in the Old Testament, God frequently expresses concern for the welfare of widows. I'll just give you a sampling. In Exodus 22, "You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, they will cry out to me. I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless." Here's another one, Deuteronomy 10. "God executes justice for the fatherless and the widow." Psalm 68:5, "Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation." Here's one more, Psalm 146:9, "The Lord upholds the widow and the fatherless, but the way of the wicked he brings to ruin." That's a theme throughout the Old Testament. There are many other passages that talk like that. And it continues into the New Testament. According to Acts 6, the church's first organized ministry was caring for widows. And in James 1:27, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world." That's what God thinks about widows. God cares about widows, and he commands us to care about widows. So now, how are we going to examine, question 4, how are we going to examine this passage? So our sermon text is about widows, and you might be thinking, well, I'm not a widow, so I can tune out of this sermon because it doesn't apply to me. This sermon does not concern me because I am not a widow. No, don't think that way. This passage is for the entire church family. That word family is important. Every member of a family has responsibilities to other people in the family. Members of a family love each other, take care of each other. And we're going to examine this passage by considering the responsibilities of 3 groups of people. First, a widow's children and grandchildren, that's her physical family. And then we'll consider a widow's church, her spiritual family. And then finally, we'll think about the widow herself. And normally when I preach on the passage of Scripture, I follow the order of the passage, sentence by sentence, clause by clause, follow the logic, trace the argument. I think for this passage it'll work a little bit better, it'll be a little clearer if I explain the responsibilities for each of these 3 groups, and as I do that, I'm going to consider the whole passage. Okay, so let's start with the first group. A widow's children and grandchildren, her physical family, are responsible to financially support her. You notice in verse 4, Paul writes, "If a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents." Why do you think the word first is there in verse 4? I think it's there because it's saying this should happen before the church gets involved. It's first the responsibility of the physical family. The first responsibility for caring for a widow is for her physical relatives to help out. It becomes the church's responsibility only when there's no physical relative to help out. So why should a widow's children and grandchildren, her physical family, why should they be responsible to help out by financially supporting her? And this passage gives a series of reasons. Paul lists at least 6. Here they are. Number 1, by doing this, verse 4, they show godliness to their own household. Now, instead of show godliness, here's how some other translations render that phrase. They show proper respect. That's the NASB. Or they learn to practice piety, LSB. NIV says they learn to put their religion into practice. the Net Bible. They learn to fulfill their duty. That's showing godliness. It is a mark of godliness to care for your widowed mother or grandmother. I've observed many of my friends do this. Some of them have invited a widowed mother to live in their home. I remember one of my theology professors did this for a very long time, all while he was teaching me while I was his student. It made a mark on me. It was not easy for him to do it, and he did it gladly. Some of my friends have intentionally lived close to their widowed mother so that they can take care of her. I'm thinking of my wife's parents who intentionally bought a home right next to his mom so they can care for her, and they've been doing that for years. Caring for an elderly widowed mother can be exhausting, and it might tempt you to think, this is taking up so much of my time that I could be spending on ministry. But take heart, according to this passage, caring for your widowed mother is ministry. Paul describes it as showing godliness. That's one reason. Here's a second reason. Make some return, that's a phrase in verse 4, implies that this is fitting. So some translations will say, instead of make some return, they'll say give back compensation, repay, pay back. I don't think I would think of it as paying back, because how do you pay back your mom for everything she did for you? You can't pay that back. But it is fitting for you to care for your widowed mother in her old age because she cared for you in your young age. It's fitting for you to care for your widowed grandmother in her old age because she cared for your parents. This is an opportunity for you to make some return. It's not repaying a debt. It's more like a thank you. And how could you ever possibly repay your mom for everything she's done for you? Here's a third reason. Verse 4, this is pleasing in the sight of God. It's acceptable in God's sight. It pleases God when you care for your widowed mom or grandmother. Fourth reason, doing this makes one, verse 7, without reproach. It makes you above reproach, beyond reproach. Not doing this brings reproach upon a widow's children or grandchildren. It makes them open to blame, open to criticism. It's shameful if you refuse to care for your widowed mother or grandmother. Here's a fifth reason, verse 8. Not doing this amounts to denying the faith and being worse than an unbeliever. Those are strong words. Why would he say that? Well, even many unbelievers take care of their family members, yet they don't claim to follow Christ. Abandoning your family is lower than pagan standards. Caring for your widowed mother or grandmother is an essential part of following Christ. Now, there's a factor from the historical cultural context that Paul and his audience probably assumed that we might be unaware of, so I'll just mention it. That factor is a woman's dowry. That's not really a part of our cultural context now. So a woman in the Greco-Roman world entered marriage with property or money that her father provided, and the person in charge of a woman's dowry was obligated to care for that woman. So when a woman was married, her husband was in charge of her dowry, and if her husband died, then she had some options. So one option was to remain in the home of her deceased husband, while one of her sons or grandsons would be in charge of her dowry. And another option was to return to her father if he was still alive. So if a son or grandson was in charge of a widow's dowry, it would be scandalous for him to avoid caring for her. And here's a sixth reason in the passage, verse 16. This frees the church of an extra burden so that it may care for those who are truly widows. Here's the whole verse 16. It says, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened so that it may care for those who are truly widows. And it's talking about a believing woman there. This principle applies to a believing man as well. So when you care for your widowed mother or grandmother, you're not using the church's limited resources. And undergirding all six of these reasons we just looked at, all six of those is the fifth commandment. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Ephesians 6 takes that and applies it directly to young children. So if you're a young child, how do you obey the fifth commandment? Ephesians 6 says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. So you know that one. How do you obey that command if you're an adult? Because it still applies to you. Honor your father and mother. One of the ways an adult child obeys that command is to financially support his widowed mother or grandmother. And here's one more, before I move on, there's a reason not in this passage, and it's in John 19. It's Christ-like to care for your mother. Do you remember this? When Jesus is on the cross, he is dying in the place of sinners. He's on a mission to save his people from his sins. He's doing the most serious, noble, amazing work in the history of the world. And in the midst of all that, John 19, verses 26 and 27 records these words. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, who was apparently a widow at the time, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. He's literally arranging for his mom while he's on the cross. It's Christ-like to care for your mother. Now, some cults say that their religious group is your new family that replaces your biological family, as if your natural family no longer exists. The Bible doesn't talk that way. Yes, the church is your spiritual family, but your natural family is still important, and you are responsible in various ways as a family member. So that is group number one. A widow's children and grandchildren or physical family are responsible to financially support her. Now let's look at the responsibility of the second group. The church, a widow's spiritual family, is responsible to respect and financially support a certain kind of widow. Now, to unpack this responsibility, I'll answer 4 questions. This is probably the trickiest part of the passage, is working through this part. So, first question, what does it mean to honor a widow? Verse 3 is straight up command, honor widows. And since Timothy's supposed to set an example for the believers, back in 4:12, that means that what he's doing, we should do as well. We should honor widows as well. So what does it mean to honor a widow? Well, let's start with the word honor. To honor someone means to give someone what he's due. So to honor a widow includes, in this passage, 2 actions. Respect a widow, and financially support a widow. Now, we have a word in English that gets at that a little bit. Have you heard the word honorarium? Honorarium. So an honorarium captures the financial payment sense of the word honor. An honorarium is a payment for a professional service that someone renders nominally without charge. So, for example, when Pastor John Piper came here recently to preach for us, he didn't ask for anything. We offered to give him something, and then he wouldn't take it. But that was an honorarium. That was not something he was charging us for. So the literary context of 1 Timothy 5 confirms that honor does not refer only to respecting widows, but also includes supporting them financially. Let me prove this to you from the passage. Verse 4 says, make some return to their parents. Verse 8 says, provide for his relatives. Verse 16, let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. So you're supposed to care. And all that caring requires financial support to some degree. The very next passage, which we'll look at next week, God willing, verses 17 and 18, says that the church must give certain elders double honor, which is talking about financial support, more financial support. So what does it mean to honor a widow? That's our first question here. Answer, it means to respect her and to financially support her. Question 2, is the church responsible to financially support every widow? Well, let's consider Galatians 6:10. Paul exhorts believers, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. as we have opportunity. What does that phrase imply? As we have opportunity. It means that sometimes we will have opportunity and sometimes we won't, right? As we have opportunity. So that means you can have a big compassionate heart. You want to be generous to lots of people. It's impossible to financially support every single person on the planet with a need. You can't do that. That's impossible. You don't have that ability. You don't have that opportunity. That same principle applies to the church as a whole. The church has limited financial resources. We simply can't support everybody with a need. It's impossible. So we have to prioritize some needs over others. Now, is the church responsible to financially support every woman in the church family who has lost her husband by death and who is not remarried? And this passage teaches the answer is clearly no. The church may generously choose to support any widow, but the church is responsible to support only a certain kind of widow. In verse 3, I'm going to show you some different translations here. The ESV says, honor widows who are truly widows. Look at what some other translations do. The King James says, widows indeed. NASB, who are actually widows. NIV, who are really in need. NRV, really need help. CSB, they're genuinely in need. Net Bible, they're truly in need. So we want to figure out who qualifies as a true widow in the sense that Paul intends here. And it's important we understand this because we as a church are responsible to financially support whoever these people are. So when a church supports a widow financially in an ongoing way, there are conditions, there are qualifications. Paul lists 2 main qualifications, and I think, this is my opinion, which I'm going to argue for, he lists an additional 2 qualifications for a total of 4. There's some debate about this, so what I'm going to do, I'll present the 4 as I see them, and I'll circle back and make a case for why I think those latter 2 should be on the list. So first qualification. The widow does not have relatives to help her, but is left all alone. So according to verse 4, if a widow has living children or grandchildren, then the widow does not qualify as a true widow in the sense that Paul intends here. A true widow must be left all alone. That's verse 5. She must be completely on her own. So if a widow has relatives, and her relatives, then her relatives are responsible to care for her. The church should not be burdened to financially support every single widow without exception, only those who are true widows. Now, before I move on, I just want to make an application to the men here in particular. Husbands and fathers, one of the ways that you can provide for your wife and your children in a way that serves our church is for you to plan now how you could financially support them in the unfortunate event that you died. Now, no one likes to think about this, but that's part of what it means to be a man, is you are providing for your family. And one of the ways you do that is thinking beyond your death. If you were to die and your family's alive, what could you do now to set them up well? I'll just share in one sentence how I do this. I do it in 3 main ways. By working hard with God's help, by paying for a life insurance policy, and by maintaining a will. It's my recommendation. I'm happy to talk more with you about that. Now let's go on to the second qualification. The widow is godly. Let's look at how Paul describes this widow in verses 5 and 9. So in verse 5, there's this phrase that she has set her hope on God. She's fixed or placed her hope on God. She's confidently trusting God. At minimum, she's a Christian. Okay? And then the next line, she continues in supplications and prayers night and day. She continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. And then in verse 9, she's been the wife of one husband. Now that phrase is really interesting. You could translate it a one-man woman. Do you remember back in chapter 3, verse 2, we're talking about qualifications for a pastor? He must be a one-woman man. This is the same phrase, but just the words are moved around, talking about a woman. A one-man woman, a one-woman man. It's referring, so if I want to be a one-woman man, it means I'm faithful to my wife. A one-man woman is a woman who's faithful to her husband. She's chaste. She is devoted solely to her husband. And this qualification does not exclude women who've been married more than once, especially since Paul encourages remarriage in verse 14. And then in verse 10, she has a reputation for good works. She's known for her good deeds. What kind of good works? And the next 5 lines unpack that. She's brought up children. So like the qualification for elders regarding children, this assumes that the widow had children. And she has shown hospitality. Some translations, like the NASB, add to strangers. She has shown hospitality to strangers. And so many English speakers today, they see the word hospitality, and they assume that refers to entertaining friends or acquaintances in a friendly and generous way. Is that hospitality? Absolutely. But that's not all it is. There's more to it than that. In the New Testament, hospitality also refers to receiving, entertaining, and lodging strangers, particularly traveling Christians who couldn't afford lodging in ancient hotels. I'm thinking of passages like Hebrews 13:2, 1 Peter 4:9, 3 John 5-8. So she's hospitable. And she has washed the feet of the saints. Some translations get the sense of that. They'll say she served believers humbly. The reason this particular action may not resonate with you as like, oh yeah, I do that all the time, is in our cultural context, people don't walk around in sandals and dusty roads and then walk into your house. And then there's a way to wash your feet there. But in that culture, that was normal. You know about this from John 13, where Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. The key here is that this woman was characterized by humbly serving people, like Jesus. And the next line says she has cared for the afflicted. She's assisted those in distress. This kind of service is not public and up front like what I'm doing right now. I'm up front very publicly. This is the kind of service that is behind the scenes that most people don't see. So don't believe the lie, ladies, that all the important stuff is public and visible. And then finally, she has devoted herself to every good work. She's well known for her good deeds because she's devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. She's a diligent servant. So this widow is godly. Further, this widow is not less than 60 years of age. You notice that in verse 9. The widow must be at least 60 years old. Younger widows do not qualify. So why the age 60? Gotta be careful here talking about women and their age. So here's my guess. At least 2 reasons. 1, a woman would be less likely to remarry or support herself at that older age. And 2, 60 years old limits the number of widows the church might be responsible to financially support. Now, the life expectancy for a Greco-Roman woman in the first century was way shorter than it is for an American woman now. And it's hard to be precise here because the data is limited. So based on limited archaeological data of like tombstones, ancient tombstones, here's what we can guess. That women in the Greco-Roman world who survived childhood lived on average into their late 30s to early 50s. That was the average lifespan. In contrast, do you know the average lifespan for a woman in America today? It's 80 to 82. So very different there. And then the fourth qualification, the church must enroll the widow on their list, the church list. Verse 9 begins, let a widow be enrolled or put on the list. And verse 11 begins, but refuse to enroll younger widows. So it appears that The church officially enrolled widows on a list in a way that both the church and the widow agreed to in an ongoing arrangement. It was a formal agreement. This was an official enrollment, and apparently the widow formally vowed or pledged to continue as a widow and to serve the Lord in that way. That's my guess of what verses 11 and 12 refer to. Verse 11, refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. So that's question 2. Is the church responsible to... No, sorry. That was... Oh boy. That was question 2. Yes, okay. I'm blanking here. Yes, that's question 2. The answer to that is no. Now, there are 2 main qualifications for a true widow. The first is she doesn't have other relatives to help her. The second is she's godly. And then I listed 2 more. The third is she's at least 60, and the fourth is that the church must enroll a widow on the list. And I said there was a debate about that. So here's where I'm going to talk about the debate. Here's the debate. Do the final 2 qualifications, 60 years old and enrolled on the list, do those apply to a widow who qualifies as a true widow, which is what I think is right, or does it qualify a widow who's in a special office of widows, like you have pastors and you have male deacons and you have widows? Some of you just went like this to me. Huh? This is a view, and it's held by people we love and respect. So I'll address this little debate by answering the next question. Question 3, why would it be wrong for a widow to desire to marry? That's really how you can get at this. In verse 11, it says it's wrong for this widow to want to marry again. So why? And then verse 12, why would a widow's remarrying incur condemnation? I mean, how would a widow's remarrying constitute abandoning her former faith? I think this is the most challenging part of the passage to interpret. So let's just start by interpreting the unclear in light of the clear. 2 sentences later, verse 14, Paul says, I would have younger widows marry. Paul is pro-marriage. He's pro-marriage in all his writings, so that's a helpful guardrail as we try to understand verses 11 and 12. John Calvin wrote a commentary on this book and on this passage. I think he rightly says, the attempt of the papists to support, by means of this passage, a vow of perpetual celibacy is absurd. He's right. In the historical cultural context of Paul's day, Roman law actually required widows under 50 to remarry within 2 years of their husband's death. That was a law in the books. So if it's clear that younger widows should remarry, then why is it wrong for these true widows who are at least 60 years old to remarry? Now, there are 3 main views on this. I'm going to briefly explain them to you and argue for the one that I think is correct. So what we're trying to figure out is, how do we make sense of verses 11 and 12 saying it's wrong to remarry, and verse 14 saying, oh, younger widows, they should remarry? How do we make sense of this? So view 1 is that it is wrong to marry an unbeliever. So according to this view, the phrase in verse 11, they desire to marry, refers to a widow desiring to marry an unbeliever. So if this is your view, then as you read verse 11, you could put in brackets an unbeliever after the word marry. It's specifically marrying an unbeliever. So in reply, this view might be right, and it is true that a believer should not marry an unbeliever. But I don't think that Paul's point in this passage is that she shouldn't marry an unbeliever, because that's not what he says. He's talking about desiring to marry, not marry an unbeliever. So here's a second view to consider. A widow who has committed to hold a special church office of seasoned widows has pledged not to remarry. And you might think this is an unusual view. Here are some men that you know who have argued for this view: John Piper, John MacArthur, and Doug Wilson. Okay, so these are our friends. Here's how this view goes. According to this view, the enrolling is not referring to who qualifies as a true widow, but instead refers to a special office of widow. So this special office of widow is a subset of the group of true widows. So you have true widows, and then a smaller group of the true widows are the office of widow, and it's those that must be 60 or older. Okay? And these seasoned widows are a special church-recognized ministry that's like women deacons. They're a special office in the church alongside the offices of pastors and deacons. These special widows minister in an official way on behalf of the church by serving fellow widows and orphans and the sick and others. And there's some evidence in church history that some Christians established a formal office of widows like this generations later in the church history. So what do we make of this view? In reply, this view might be right. I'm not going to say it's definitely wrong, but I'm not convinced of it for 3 reasons. 1, nothing in the text says any of that. It's all conjecture. If you just read the text, you don't come out with that. Second, the main purpose of this passage is to specify who qualifies as a true widow. Who qualifies to receive financial support. All of this is to help us know that. And this view would have us, it's almost like a digression. And then third, to interpret this text by citing the practice of Christians later in church history having a formal office of widows is anachronistic. It'd be like somebody in a World War II movie using an iPhone. That doesn't go there. So I'm not convinced this view is right, but it might be right. I think this third view is better, so let me make a case for this one. A widow who has committed to be enrolled on the church's list and thus to receive financial support has pledged not to remarry. That's what I think verses 11 and 12 are referring to. So when a church formally enrolls a widow to receive financial support, the widow then vows to continue serving the Lord as a widow, and for her to break her vow, to break her pledge, would be sinful. And this view makes sense of the requirement that such a widow be at least 60, in verse 9. Widows who are at least 60 may pledge to remain widows who are enrolled on the church's list. If they were to remarry, they would incur condemnation, verse 12. A better translation might be like the NIV says, they would bring judgment on themselves. I don't think it means they go to hell automatically. Now, why would they bring judgment on themselves? The ESV says in verse 12, they abandoned their former faith. And I would prefer a slightly different translation there. So here's how some others put it. They have ignored their previous pledge, that's NASB, or they've set aside their previous pledge, LSB. They've broken their first pledge, NIV. They've renounced their original pledge, CSB. I think that's the idea. Now, some might object to what I just argued like this. They'd say, well, why must a widow who is at least 60 years old commit to never remarry in order for the church to financially support her in an ongoing way? Why can't the church support her for as long as she's unmarried? Like, what if she's 62 and she meets a Christian man who'd be an outstanding husband? Why should she be bound to singleness? It seems like remarrying would be both to her advantage, since she would receive companionship and financial support, and it would be to the church's advantage, since she would no longer need financial support from the church. What's the advantage to the church for enrolling a woman who is at least 60 years old to some special list of widows who receive ongoing financial support on the condition that she doesn't remarry? Okay, that's a good objection. And in reply, all I have is a guess. I'm looking at the same text you are, and so there's just not a whole lot here to know for certain. Here's my guess. Such a widow would not be constantly on the lookout for a new husband, but if she pledged not to remarry when she was at least 60 years old, she would be focused single-mindedly on praying night and day for the church. Verse 5, she would commit to doing good works in a fitting way on behalf of the church, and because she's left all alone, verse 5, she has no other surviving family members, she would be free to invest full-time in her spiritual family as a Titus II older woman. So that's question 3. Why would it be wrong for a widow to desire to marry? I think the most likely answer is that a widow who is committed to be enrolled on the church's list and thus receive financial support from the church has pledged not to remarry. Question 4, what are some practical examples of how a church may serve widows? The principle in this passage is that a church should honor a true widow by respecting her and by financially supporting her. So the way a church applies that is going to look different depending on your historical cultural context. In Paul's day, it was devastating financially to be a widow. In our cultural context now, it's not nearly as financially challenging to be a widow. It's because we have welfare and Social Security and pensions and retirement benefits and employment options and life insurance. So how would we work this out in our context? Now, I got some help here. I mentioned my wife's father-in-law earlier in the sermon. His name is Doug Becker. He's fantastic. And he has been serving as a pastor, one of the pastors of a large church in South Carolina since 1989. And I asked him to share some wisdom with me on widows. I preached on this passage like 20 years ago, and I asked him then. And then I just asked him recently, hey, you told me this 20 years ago. Would you update your advice? And he read it over and said, I still agree with that. So here's what he said 20 years ago and still stands by. I think it's his wise advice. He says, many widows in our affluent society do not need financial assistance, though they may need financial counsel or guidance. We've had a few situations in our church, so I can share a bit from experience. We normally would have one point of contact with the lady, usually an elder, but it could be a deacon, and he would speak to her to get a feel for her needs. So what he does is he goes on and he gives 3 test cases, examples to show how this works out. So here's example 1. One lady in our church had 4 children living at home or in the college dorms when her husband died. Our elders recommended that the men's ministry take their family as a project with the goal to get her house into a shape that she would not have any major concerns for years to come. She was able to pay off the house with life insurance. The men's ministry, in combination with benevolence funds, rewired her house, put replacement windows in, put a new heating and AC system in, painted the exterior of the house, and we determined that if she continued to work at a Christian school, she would be able to make it okay. The goal was to help her and her family be self-sufficient, and it appears this worked well. Example 2. In contrast, when another lady's husband died, we determined that the situation was entirely different. They had sufficient funds, her house was in good shape, she had an adult son living at home with her. So I would summarize by saying we live in a very affluent society. Our position has not been to reject the normal government safety options, like net options like Social Security, but to help put the person in a position to be self-sufficient. Example 3, we've not had a destitute widow in the congregation that I can recall. And that's an interesting observation. It's a very large church, has been for decades. And he told me recently he still can't recall a widow who would be what Paul calls a true widow in 1 Timothy 5 in their context in like the last 40 years. Interesting, isn't it? He says, we have had one family that is practically a widow situation because of desertion. The mother has been exemplary in providing for her large family. She's never asked for help, but when it began to become apparent that she needed some financial assistance, we worked out a plan where one of the pastors would check on her situation about every 6 months or so. We used benevolence to buy tires, replace their heating and air, pay medical bills, etc. They're now in a much better situation since the children are old enough to earn income to help out. So 2 final thoughts, he says, is the right thing to do is investigate, not close our eyes to these opportunities to help sisters in need. And the first source of help, according to the passage, should be the person's own family. It's wise advice. I've got a good father-in-law, too. Okay, so that is responsibility number 2 for the church. The church, a widow's spiritual family, is responsible to respect and financially support a certain kind of widow. Now let's conclude by considering one final group, and that is the widow herself. A widow is responsible to be honorable. So a widow's physical family and spiritual family are responsible to honor her by financially supporting her. What's she responsible to do? She's responsible to be a particular kind of woman, an honorable woman, an honorable widow. So ladies in particular, as we consider this responsibility of a widow, even if you're not a widow, you should pay attention here, because the way that Paul describes this honorable widow is describing an honorable woman. This is the kind of woman you want to be. So as you hear Paul describe this honorable widow, think, oh, that's the kind of woman I want to be. So here are 4 characteristics of an honorable widow or an honorable woman. First, She's godly. She's put her hope in God, verse 5. She prays continuously. Verse 9, she's been the wife of one husband. She's been faithful to her husband. So she's devoted to prayer. She sets her hope on God. She is chaste. Characteristic 2, she is not self-indulgent. Verse 6, a dishonorable widow indulges in luxury. She lives for pleasure. So a church would be unwise to use their limited financial resources to support a widow whose pleasure is luxurious living. A woman who lives only for pleasure is dead even while she lives, verse 6. She's dead spiritually. She's unregenerate. Characteristic 3, an honorable widow does not share the negative traits of some younger widows. What I'm about to say here may be alarming to you because feminism permeates our cultural context. It may surprise you to hear a pastor preach from the Bible that women sin. It wasn't supposed to be funny. I'm glad you think it's funny. Okay, so it doesn't surprise anybody to think that men sin. That's obvious. Men readily admit that they're prone to sin by being angry and by lusting and by lacking self-discipline. The sins of men are obvious. They wear them on their sleeves. Everybody sees them. Everybody feels the force of them, and they can talk openly about them. But how are women prone to sin? Many women today, if you were to ask them that question, and they really thought about it, there have been studies where this has happened, their number one sin is low self-esteem. Not thinking highly enough of themselves. That's number one. Look it up. Ask your AI. All right, so not now. All right. What about sins such as gossip, backbiting, nagging, disrespect, slander, envy, bitterness, wanting to be lusted after? I could go on, but I'll just let those 8 kind of waft out there. Now, one biblical counselor says this: when is the last time the pastor called out a woman for her sin? Women's sin can sometimes look different than men's. Some of their sins of manipulation, bitterness, or lust for control are often overlooked by pastors and counselors. They may be more subtle about these sins, whereas men's sins of porn use, drinking, and adultery are usually quite obvious and brazen. Women are often far more crafty, and their sins can easily be missed. So, what negative traits do some younger widows have? Paul in this passage highlights 3. Let me show them to you. Negative trait number 1 is in verse 11. Some younger widows follow their passions instead of Christ. Their passions draw them away from Christ. Their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ. They might want pleasure, the wrong kind of pleasure. We all want pleasure in a good way, and there's a bad way to want it too. And they want pleasure more than they want Christ. They're drawn away from Christ by desire. They pursue sensuous desires in opposition to Christ. Their physical desires overpower their devotion to Christ. Here's negative trait number 2, verse 13. Some younger widows are idle. Verse 13 says, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house. In other words, they get into the habit of having nothing to do. Instead of devoting themselves to good works that God has called women to do, they go around from house to house. They're not making themselves busy with the vast amount of good works that God designed women to do. If you're a godly woman, you're not bored. There's so much to do. An ungodly woman is idle. And negative trait number 3, some younger widows, verse 13, are gossips and busybodies. That is, that's what they're doing when they go from house to house. They're gossips. They're busybodies. That's what they're learning to do, saying what they should not. They talk nonsense. They go about meddling in other people's business and talking about things they shouldn't. I was just quoting the NLT. So for women to be meddling themselves like this, they used to have to physically travel from place to place to hear the news, to tell someone else the latest gossip. But with modern technology, and I'm not just talking about a telephone, women can be a meddling busybody everywhere they can get access to the internet, which is pretty much everywhere now. So men and women are inclined to sin in different ways. Women tend to sin with their tongues by being gossips and busybodies. And an honorable woman doesn't do that. Characteristic 4 of an honorable widow is in verse 14. Verse 14 says, I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. So an honorable widow who is younger should marry, bear children, manage her household, her house, keep house, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. That's the creational norm for women. Marry, bear children, bring up children, manage your household, and be hospitable. That's back in verse 10. This model of what it looks like is, I'd say the woman in Proverbs 31 shows us, that's what this woman looks like in all her glory. Now this isn't mere traditionalism. This is God's design for women. And when a Christian woman rejects God's good design for women, look at how Paul describes her. She's giving the adversary an occasion for slander. She's straying after Satan. End of verse 14. Turning away from God's good design for men and women is satanic. So, women, don't believe the lie that a woman is settling for something that's second best if she marries and bears children and brings up children and manages her household and is hospitable. That's the creational norm. That's what God designed for women, and it's glorious and it's honorable. And when a woman rejects that, she's following Satan. God designed women to bear children and bring up children. Our culture mocks women who prioritize that. Our culture is rebelling against God's good design for men and women, and that rebellion is satanic. Many people in our culture think that pets are more valuable than children, or at least equal to children. It's even in commercials now. That's rebelling against God's good design for women. So a widow is responsible to be honorable. That's the third group. So you had the responsibility of the physical family, the spiritual family, and the widow herself. The widow is responsible to be honorable. Now, let me briefly conclude with 3 exhortations that correspond to those 3 responsibilities. So first, for physical family. Financially support your physical family. That's your responsibility. That's not the church's responsibility. So work hard. Be a wise steward of the wealth that God gives you. He's entrusting you with it. So work heartily as to the Lord so that you can be generous to your family and let that overflow so you can be generous to others. Exhortation 2 is to the church. Church, as the opportunity arises, so I'm thinking of Galatians 6:10 there, let's meet our responsibility to financially support widows. Specifically, we are responsible to support true widows, the ones that Paul describes in this passage. But let's also ask God for wisdom to be generous with our limited resources to others who are in need. Each of us should prioritize financially supporting our own physical families. The church should prioritize supporting true widows. And beyond that, we need wisdom how to be generous with what's left. And there's a lot left. God has entrusted us with a lot. As Paul exhorts in Galatians 6:10, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Exhortation 3, finally. Ladies, with God's help, be an honorable woman. Be like this woman Paul describes in 1 Timothy 5. Don't be an idler who becomes a gossip and a busybody, with God's help, prioritize marriage. Prioritize bringing up children. Prioritize managing your household. Devote yourself, verse 10, to every good work. And also, ladies, don't believe the lie that your best years are when you are young and full of youthful energy and youthful beauty. Godly older women can minister to younger women in a way that younger women can't. We need godly older women. It's so important for our church. The type of women that 1 Timothy 5 and Titus 2 talks about. They're such a gift to our people. So ladies, I exhort you, with God's help, be an honorable woman. Let's pray. Father, would you please help all of us to work hard and be wise stewards of the wealth that you entrust us with? Please give us grace to fulfill our responsibilities to support our physical family. And would you also help our church to meet our responsibility to financially support widows and to have wisdom to help others in need as well? And would you please graciously help our women to be honorable women? We ask in the name of Jesus, amen.